Thank you very much. Welcome everybody to Berlin. We're glad to receive you here in the meeting room of the European Affairs Committee of the German Bundestag. So I was sitting over there for some years. I'd like to address this challenging issue of multilateralism because what we are experiencing now in Ukraine is a turning point. Yes, the war in Ukraine started already in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. Yes, there were attacks of Russia towards neighboring countries before, but what is new and what is a new quality of aggression is that Russia simply denies the sovereignty of a nation of 44 million people. And it's even more disturbing the international order since Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations. At the same time, we listen to alarming remarks from China towards Taiwan, explicitly including military attacks on Taiwan. In this situation, the multilateral order seems to be significantly attacked as well, because at least one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council explicitly infringed this order, which from the broad majority of states and citizens is seen as a universal order. The approach of Russia is, I would say, as a European and as a German, the complete opposite of the way the European Union took in recent decades. The history of European integration after the Second World War is based on the mutual understanding that we need partnerships at eye level in Europe, involving big and smaller member countries of the European Union. In contradiction to this approach of partnerships at eye level, I always asked Russian delegations for years when they came to the Bundestag, what is your offer to your neighboring countries? And in contradiction to partnership of at eye level, I could only see for years now the offer of Russia towards its neighboring countries is dominance. It's supremacy, and from the side of neighboring countries, it's subordination and suppression. And that's why this model is not very inviting, not very attractive for Russia's neighboring countries. And they tend to get closer to the European Union and to realize which benefits democracy, the rule of law, can have for their populations as well. In this fundamental discussion, yes, there is a systemic rivalry between democracies and autocracies, between partnership and supremacy towards others. But I still believe that we need a universal multilateral order securing human rights and establishing instruments for keeping peace and building peace. In recent years, European countries, in particular the German government, tried to establish an alliance for multilateralism. But this alliance has mainly been a forum for talks, discussions. It was not sustained by hard power instruments. And this is one of the lessons we have to learn in Europe, and particularly in Germany, that hard power is at place in this world. We have to understand actors who prefer military means. And that's why we have to learn this hard power policy as well, in a way that we can resist those actors who attack our multilateral order. In Germany, there was an understanding over years that there are no military solutions for political problems. We can only solve political problems by political means, by diplomacy. And we have to understand that this is simply not true, because there are actors on this globe who prefer military means, who prefer violence to achieve their political goals simply because they can. And for months now, many actors tried to get Russia at the table of negotiations. It's not possible. They are not willing to negotiate, because in their perception, they have an opportunity to win by military means and by violence. And in this context, I think we have to change our approach, our understanding we had for a long time, at least in Germany. And this mantra saying there is no political solution, there is no military solution for political problems has been wrong. In Germany, we had the understanding of saying violence is no solution. After 4 or 5 months of war in Ukraine, we have to admit no violence is no solution, because we can only stop an actor like Putin by using military means as well. And that's why we have to be clear on the limitations of our concept of multilateral understanding, negotiations, diplomacy, and we have also to re-establish the hard power that is needed to resist those actors who intend to infringe our multilateral order. That's what we try to do now in the European Union, in NATO. And my conclusion for us Europeans and Germans is we have to get the political will, we have to speak out the political will that we want to keep our security in Europe by our own means. And this means a lot. In Europe means not only member countries of the European Union or NATO, but all democracies in Europe. In Europe who wants to live in freedom and democracy, we have to be able to support them, and of course we have to be able to secure our own territories as well, which is already done in NATO, but we have to strengthen the European pillar of NATO in doing our homework. That's why you could read a lot about German investments in our armed forces, which is not new in quality, but which allows us an acceleration of procurement proceedings. This is, I think, one first conclusion we have to draw from this attack on the multilateral order by the war in Ukraine, to gain a global approach to global problems, but to strengthen our own capacities on the way of strengthening our multilateral fora and orders. So I do not see that the multilateral order in total is violated in a way that it's dysfunctional. This is not the case. On the contrary, the broad majority of countries, of citizens on this globe, is still dependent from multilateral fora. There are only a few countries who can make power policy. United States, China, Russia intends to do so. I'm not so sure whether this will be sustained. But in the end, all the other countries will not be able to do power politics in this way. They are dependent on partners around this globe. And this is also the case for European countries. We will always depend from partners outside Europe because we will not be autark in, for example, energy supply, or, for example, in supply of other natural resources. So autarky, which is possible for superpowers, is not possible for European countries, and that's why we will remain dependent from partners outside Europe, and that's why we will remain partners of all those who want to strengthen our multilateral order, because these four are, I would say, they are not in a contradiction to superpowers. They are integrated in this multilateral order. But those who want to infringe our universal rights have to feel a strong partnership of those who defend our multilateral order. And in my understanding, this is the case not only in Europe, but also in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. There is a majority of countries, a majority of citizens around the globe who is dependent from functioning multilateral fora. So I'm not without hope. On the contrary, I think that this escalation in Ukraine could also strengthen the understanding of the necessity of multilateral fora. But I would say there is a bit more needed. We also need a new focus on bilateral relations. This is maybe a German perspective, because we are very much engaged in European Union decision-making. And in this way of decision-making in Brussels, we may not forget or neglect the necessity of strong bilateral relations among capitals as well. That's why, for example, this German Bundestag is heavily engaged in bilateral relations to parliaments across our European continent as well. When it comes to the future of multilateralism, I would say we have to complement all the efforts of mutual discussions and negotiations by some hard power instruments, as it has been laid down in the Charter of the United Nations. This should be strengthened. But we will also need some bi-regional fora, for example, and one of my messages is that we should extend our cooperation in the Northern Hemisphere between Northern America and Europe by adding our economic issues and by integrating the Global South to our Transatlantic partnership. So far, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is a Northern American and European cooperation focused on foreign and security policy. This will stay, but we should complement this NATO cooperation on foreign and security policy by stronger efforts in economic and trade relations. This is simply necessary for Europe when it comes to energy supply, but also to supply chains in general. And I think we can also strengthen our transatlantic partnership by integrating Latin American and African countries in our trade relations in a stronger way than we did so far. So when I look at Latin America, for example, but also to Africa, there are many, many countries who can significantly contribute to food supply in the world, to energy supply in the world. And so they can bring in their own capacities. They are not only countries that are seen under development policy aspects, but as strong partners at eye level. This is a different approach. And that's why I strive for integrating better Latin America and Africa in our transatlantic discussions. In the end, Germany, in particular Germany, but all European countries also benefited a lot from American contributions to European security, from cheap energy from Russia for Europe, from cheap production in China for Europe. So our welfare in Europe is to a large extent based on security provided by the United States and North Atlantic partners, energy provided by Russia, products provided by China. But this economically beneficiary way of living has some political price. And this price has now to be internalized in our foreign policy and economic and trade discussions. And that's why we have to reduce our dependencies in energy supply from Russia. We also have to reduce our dependencies from China in global supply chains. And we have to strengthen our European pillar of security within the NATO alliance. And in this way, I think we have to do a lot, we have to invest a lot, but on this way, we will remain a strong and reliable partner for our partners in the European Union and in NATO as well. And this also is a strong contribution for strengthening our multilateral order. I still believe in a universal order as it is laid down in the Charter of the United Nations, which represents a majority of citizens and a majority of states that want to live in peace, but also in democracy and under the rule of law. Thank you very much for your attention.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Silberhorn, for this enlightening presentation and analysis and explanation of the German vision for a just and peaceful international order on the basis of multilateralism in the framework of European cooperation and of widening that cooperation with other regions of the world, going beyond the traditional transatlantic framework. We have now got time for discussion until around 11 o'clock. If you just allow me to address one particular issue, which you have also emphasized so strongly, namely the universal nature of the United Nations Charter. Indeed, this document adopted in 1945 is based on a philosophy of multilateralism, and the essence of preservation, maintenance, and restoration of peace, according to the Charter, is the joint action of the international community in a clearly set out framework, namely that of the competences of the Security Council. Unfortunately, if you allow me just to raise that issue, unfortunately, the founders of the Charter, those who drafted it at Dumbarton Oaks, have inserted, so to speak, a contradiction from the very beginning. And interestingly, delegates of Latin American states, in particularly of Mexico, did pay attention to that and did raise this issue at the founding conference in San Francisco in '45. And what I mean is Article 27. Everything is beautiful and perfect as far as the competences of the Security Council are concerned under Chapter 7, namely the coercive powers in terms of economic measures, economic sanctions, and even the use of force if a member state violates the Charter and commits an act of aggression. But the error is in the writing of Article 27, because there are 5 states, those were the founders who drafted the charters, who are permanent members, that means who are in the Council without election, and who not only have the privilege to veto any decision, but also who are not obliged to abstain from voting if they themselves commit an act of aggression. And that's now the problem exactly in regard to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. A permanent member can act above the law without any consideration for the law, as long as it is prepared to use these privileges. It can invade a country and can veto any decision by the Council. So no action whatsoever in terms of Chapter 7, the resolutions of the Council, can be taken. Of course, this is not the first time. This is always something we should be aware here. It's not so dramatic as politicians in Europe say that now we are entering a new era of lawlessness. This has been with us all along, since '45, and there were unilateral wars of aggression where the UN could do nothing. Wars committed or initiated not only by the Soviet Union at that time, but also by other permanent members. And so one should be very cautious just to avoid a kind of double standards. But the big challenge, as Mr. Silberhorn has now presented to us, the big challenge for the international community is how to make that system functional. And the option of realpolitik, which you also mentioned, when the procedures, the legal procedures are not available, when they do not work, the option of realpolitik, namely of setting hope in a military decision, as now also Joseph Borrell has said. He said this will be decided in Ukraine not by diplomacy or negotiations, but on the battlefield. That's what he said around 1 or 2 weeks ago. But this option, and that's why I quoted President Kennedy from his commencement speech at the American University, this option can be very risky when a situation arises in which the conflict escalates so far that the other side feels cornered, as is now a risk also, and may resort to a desperate act. That is what Kennedy warned about. And too often now, leaders, of course first in Russia, but then also reacting to that in the Western world, have already been mentioning this threat of the nuclear option. So the big question is, can the international community, which you described, and to which certainly belong so many of the states in Africa, in Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, can this international community, which is the overwhelming majority of UN member states, we have also seen that in the General Assembly resolution shortly after the Russian invasion, which was, which was quite impressive, the condemnation of this as a violation of international law. But how can they make sure that the universality of the Charter will be respected? And we should not forget, when in '45 the organization was established in San Francisco in June, for the 5 founders, the permanent members, of course, to be fair, one must say France was not part of that initially because it was still under occupation when they negotiated the charter, but all the 4 others have to be mentioned. But for them it was clear, and Cordell Hull, who was Secretary of State of the United States, said so quite openly in his memoirs, for the United States, not only for the Soviet Union, but also for the United States, they would never have considered to join the organization or to remain in it without those procedural privileges of Article 27, namely the veto. He put it down in writing. So how can this predicament, so to speak, be overcome? Will moral force and moral conviction be enough, or will it ultimately again be a constellation, as so often described perfectly by Henry Kissinger in his, particularly in his opus magnum, Diplomacy? Will it ultimately be a framework in which a real politique dominates? And this means not only, but does not necessarily mean to fight it out until the bitter end, which in our case now could be a total destruction of all involved, but realpolitik also means to bargain, to negotiate about interests, and to seek a compromise. And that is what Henry Kissinger now has also been proposing shortly after the war started. So my question would be how you, as a leading German politician who also served as Secretary of State at the Parliamentary Secretary of State at the Ministry of Defense, think one could overcome this real dilemma, which John Mearsheimer, the professor at the University of Chicago, characterized as the tragedy of great power politics.
Thank you very much for this most interesting question. It's indeed a dilemma since the founding of the United Nations. And as you rightly pointed out, the strong nations, the superpowers, always made this caveat that they are willing to make use of a multilateral order as far as it is useful or beneficial for them, but if not, they can act differently. So this United Nations Charter is the substance of what is a universal consensus, but it cannot go beyond a consensus with superpowers. And in the end, as far as this multilateral order is not functional, it depends on the superpowers to balance their interests. But even if they take unilateral action, the multilateral or the international community can also take multilateral action. This will also be beyond the United Nations Charter, or on the basis of the United Nations Charter, but not within the 4 are laid down there. So I think the message of non-superpowers to superpowers should be, if you act unilaterally, this will cost you a price anyway. And the international community is able to increase this price by acting multilaterally. And I think this is also real politics. And in a certain way, response to unilateral actors. But the strength of the multilateral action is maybe not military power, but the simple size of the number of states and citizens. And if you look at the war in Ukraine, it has been the United Nations and the UN Secretary General who made this agreement possible on crop exports across the Black Sea. So there is a legitimate role of the United Nations, even in those cases when the multilateral order is infringed by P5 members. And to conclude, Germany and Japan were enemy states under the UN Charter from 1945. Today we are in a situation where both Japan and Germany made offers to join the Security Council, whereas even permanent members of the Security Council could be seen as enemy states in the current situation. So of course, this UN Charter is a document of its time, 1945. It reflects the situation at the end of the Second World War. And we now had long-standing discussions over decades already how to adapt this order to a changing global situation, but it can only be adapted by consensus again. So we have to live with this order, but there are countries with constitutions even much older than this UN Charter. And in this regard, some adaptation is already possible under the auspices of real politics. We cannot overcome what cannot be adopted by all member countries. But I would stress this opportunity of multilateral action, which in itself is a factor that cannot be ignored by superpowers who prefer unilateral action. And in this regard, yes, you can name this as a moral power or simply as the strength of the number of actors. But in the end, it, I think, will strengthen the mutual understanding that we need something like this. If we hadn't such a charter, we had to invent it, because the real dilemma is not the dysfunctionality of bodies or member countries of the United Nations. The real dilemma is that the problems we are challenging are really global problems, one addressing humankind as a whole. And that's why we need even more multilateral fora, not only the United Nations, but based on this charter, many multilateral fora addressing the global challenges we have to address. And in this regard, I think the last 8-10 years brought some significant progress with the Paris Charter on climate protection, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. So there is an even broader consensus on specific issues of global politics that goes far beyond former agreements we had, and which are really global and multilateral commitments that nearly every country on this globe has signed. So, and again, I have some hope that multilateralism has become even stronger, driven by the problems we are already facing.
I invite the delegates, the participants, to ask questions and statements. We still have got around 10 minutes or so. Can you give me a sign? Please, Mr. Bagration, former Prime Minister of Armenia, please.
Thank you for the interesting ideas and sharing view with us on the global security. I have a question. You said that European Union has to limit its dependency on the Russian energy resources, also on its dependency on the China logistic chain. And you said also about security, mentioning that the security now is covered by the United States. Yeah. What you are planning to do that with security? To cut or to make shorter dependency on the energy resources, I understand. Just you have to change the suppliers, with you need time for that, and that's EU is going to do. Is EU planning to have its own security system? What you are going to do, especially Germany declared that they are going to distribute something like up to 100 billion euros on the defense expenses to create very powerful army. And what it means, there is a plan to make the huge system of European security. That means, if it is like this, to reduce NATO's influence, or to do all these steps in frame of NATO, or whatever. Do you have any idea to share with us that?
First, in the energy sector, we will invest more in renewable energy. We will now temporarily increase the supply by coal-fired plants. We have a domestic discussion on nuclear power plants, so I'm convinced that the government will concede to keep the last nuclear power plants on the grid at the end of this year. This has to be decided in the months and weeks ahead of us. We have prominent economists recommending us not to invest in gas-fired plants, because huge investments of billions of euros would need a time of 30, 40 years in usage for these power plants. So their recommendation is to secure the next few years by keeping the nuclear power plants on the grid and increasing the supply by coal-fired plants, and then invest much, much more in hydrogen power and in renewable energy. In this regard, we have to readapt our partnerships. For an interim period, there will be more supply with oil and gas from Western partners, maybe also from partners from Arab nations. Of course, all these partners are interested in getting long-term commitments, but in the end, it's clear to everybody that we have to become completely independent from fossil fuels. And that's why the Russian economy is not really a prospective future with this strong focus on fossil fuels. In finding new partners, we have to strive out as Europeans, not only Germany, many European partners as well. But we also invested in promising renewable energy projects, for example, on the African continent. the biggest solar power plant has been built in Ouarzazate in Morocco by German development policy years ago. One of the biggest wind power plants has been built in Egypt with German companies and supported by German development cooperation. And just recently, there was a study published on the capacity of renewable energy on the African continent. It would be sufficient for supplying the entire world with energy. Of course, we also have to invest in research, but there are promising partnerships we already have in Africa, and also mentioned Latin America. I think this is a new opportunity for bringing the global South really to the table and to play an active role both in Latin America and in Africa that is most relevant for achieving our sustainable development goals. And of course, this includes, at first, a stronger development in all these countries. So we had years of discussions how to combine the know-how and the financing of industrialized nations with the needs and capacities of developing nations. Now in the energy sector, this is to be complemented in a beneficial way for all of us. And the shortfalls now that we are threatened with in Europe will drive this discussion significantly. So we will be able to accelerate, I think, all these investments. In the field of armed forces and our security in Europe, we have to see that so far the United States are the main provider of security in Europe. In my understanding, the United States have an autonomous planning for security in their partner countries. They make use of NATO as far as it is useful, but they go even beyond, and that could be seen at the NATO summit in Madrid when President Biden presented a variety of support from the United States for Europe, including fighter aircraft squadrons for Great Britain, troops for Poland and Romania, air defense in Germany and Italy. So they did a comprehensive planning on their own for securing Europe. And my answer to this is, thank you very much, but in the end, we should be able to do this on our own as Europeans. And I think this is what American citizens also expect, but we shouldn't do it because Americans expect it, but because we are interested in securing our own territory. How long should the Americans support Europe in this way? The United States do much, much more for the Ukraine than all European countries together. Is this the future of security in Europe? I think we should gain the understanding, the own understanding in Europe, that it's our job to do what we can to secure our territories. And that's why the German government was willing to give more money. In the end, this is nothing else that has already been in planning for some years, because the NATO planning periods go until 2031 so far, for example. Now, with additional 100 billion euros, we are able to accelerate all the procurement, and this money will be spent during one legislative period only, so until 2025, hopefully. And then we will need again additional money in this volume. So this 100 billion pledge is a significant step forward for this legislative term. but it's by far not enough to achieve the goals we have well coordinated among NATO and European Union member countries. So it's nothing new, it's just an acceleration of what we should have done already, or would have done all the same, but we can do it some years earlier, and this will, of course, hopefully invite and initiate activities from our partners in Europe as well. And then there are some very sensitive issues, for example, when it comes to nuclear deterrence. In this regard, I think transatlantic cooperation is indispensable. It's part of our deterrence, that both in Northern America and in Europe we are partnering our capabilities. But of course we have to realize in Europe that nuclear protection for Europe that is backed by the United States includes also risks for American citizens in cases of escalation. At the same time, we have to carefully address again the coordination among European and NATO member countries, in particular Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. You know that the French nuclear powers are not fully integrated in NATO. Great Britain is no longer a member of the European Union, and Germany has got a treaty of our independence in 1990, 2+4 treaty, in which is based that no German nuclear weapons are based on German territory. So this in mind, we have to better coordinate our capabilities in this regard, since nuclear threats have been spoken out several times now. At the 3 days after the Russian aggression in Ukraine, so we are fully aware of the situation. Russia is not the only adversary threatening us by nuclear weapons, but since we are now readjusting our security system in Europe, we should keep in mind that these sensitive questions have to be adequately addressed, and we have to coordinate ourselves in Europe in the best possible way.
Yeah, we have.
Thank you all for giving us this opportunity to attend here. Thank you, Mr. For your detailed explanation of what happened and the realistic observation. And thank you, Professor Koster, for saying what I wanted to say about the realization of the functionality, real functionality of the UN and the multilateral actions. You have mentioned about future steps you want to take is to cooperate with democratic regimes in our democratic countries in the world. I think after almost 70 years of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, you observed now, after a ferocious war on Ukraine, the unfunctionality of the UN in the Security Council. About democracy, this is not, do you consider again another binary view, especially the region is full of non-democratic, supported by European and Western world, and in this aspect you are only dealing with democratic countries. So how you solve this? Supporting the non-democratic regimes, and you are cooperating with democracy only. And what's the definition of democracy, and what's the definition of human rights in that aspect? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Not to be misunderstood, my argument was that we should have the political will in Germany and in Europe to support all democracies on European soil. And this is a message because we are used to work together within the framework of the European Union or within NATO. But there are some democracies that are not member countries of NATO and not member countries of the European Union. And here my argument is they are democracies. And that's why we have to support them, on whom they should rely. Because they are not supported by autocracies, they are threatened by autocratic neighboring countries. That's why this is an additional support we do not deliver so far as Europeans and Germans, and Ukraine is one example for this. But there are some other democracies like Moldova, Georgia, and I think we have to state the political will of Europeans to cooperate together and to support democracies also in the case of escalation if they are under threat. On a global perspective, I do believe indeed that we should closer cooperate with democracies because we share common values and because it's easier to cooperate with democracies. They have legitimate governments, elected by citizens. But of course, we should not create such a binary world, and then we would have to interpret what the situation in a variety of countries is. This is not my intention. We should gain a global perspective and cooperate with everybody who is willing to cooperate in multilateral fora, but we have to differentiate it in another way. I think we can learn a lot, for example, from Taiwan in how they are dealing with China. In substance, I would say, with autocratic countries, we should better differentiate in which fields cooperation is possible, in which fields a simple coordination in multilateral fora, for example, is needed, and where confrontation is unavoidable. So this can be done in bilateral or multilateral relations at the same time. Cooperation or coordination or confrontation, depending on the interests that autocratic countries follow and based on the values we share as democracies. And when it comes to real politics or a pragmatic approach in politics, yes, I think indeed that we as Democrats should be open for profound relations also to non-democratic countries. And we should find a pragmatic way in dealing also with sensitive issues with those countries. For example, when it comes to armament exports. Yes, there might be sensitive questions when you export weapons to countries that are in conflict. Let me name India. But it's a huge country, 1.4 million inhabitants. They have to have a police in their country. They have to secure their domestic order. And it should not be the position of Democrats to leave those countries to autocratic actors only. We should play a role. So when we are interested in spreading our values and democratic order, we should find a pragmatic way in how to cooperate with democratic countries, but also with democratic countries that might not meet our conditions in all aspects. So we have to pose the right question. So very often in international politics, the alternatives are only seen from your own perspective. But this would be wrong. We cannot base international cooperation on the question whether a partner shares our values or not. International politics is needed because there are different interests, because there are different values. Otherwise, you would need no diplomats. And we would better ask the question in which alternative the partner is. And that's why very often we do not ask the right questions in international politics, because we tend to see the world via our own glasses. And if we try to see the world via the perspectives of and interests of our partners, then we come to the right alternatives and the right questions. And then we can also deliver. Then we see it's not white and black. There are so many steps of gray. And international politics means to identify these gray zones and to find the room of maneuver within black and white and find possible solutions that address the needs of partner countries, but also reflects the position in values in which we do politics.
And with this differentiated approach by Mr. Silberhorn concerning the right balancing between idealism and realism in international relations, essentially both aimed at preserving peace and avoiding total catastrophe, we conclude this first part of our session at the German Bundestag, and we thank Mr. Silberhorn for hosting us here in this magnificent hall and building. Thank you so much.